Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Talking Global Politics with Dr. Detzi and Dr. Kusluch. So, I am Joseph Kusluch, and on today's episode, we are going to begin with a seemingly simple question. Is it the U.S. policy to wage war in Iran? Dan is going to argue that it is not. And he makes this argument because constitutional processes have, by and large, been bypassed in this instance. Therefore, it is President Trump's policy to wage war in Iran, not necessarily US policy. And that's a significant difference, which he's going to lay out. He'll delve into the well documented discussions of the framers of the Constitution on the matter of war and peace, as well as the post Vietnam War Powers Act passed by Congress in 1973, elucidating on why foreign policy decision making, especially on matters of war and peace, were not meant to sit solely in the executive branch decision making. We'll discuss what this means regarding foreign policy and regarding American democracy. So, Dan, if you would like to kick us off today.
Sure thing. So that question sounded very odd because why would it not be U.S. policy to wage war in Iran since the United States is waging war? So you assume that it's U.S. policy. Um, and as Joe said, I kind of argue that it's not U.S. policy because it hasn't been debated in Congress. It hasn't been, I mean, there's been efforts to justify it in the public sphere, but there's been no authorization to use military force. And even the war powers resolutions, which I'll talk about later, is being bypassed more than it has been in the past. And to be clear, every president since the war powers resolution was passed in 1973 has tried to get around it in one shape or form or another. But we've always had
Dan say
Congress.
it's unconstitutional.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so we've always had and Congress pushing back, this is a different situation. That's why I argue it's not U.S. policy to do this. And even when you hear President Trump's press secretary talk in front of reporters, she says Trump wants this, Trump wants that. She's not saying guising it in the sense that this is the U.S. position. This is Trump's position. Um, and I don't think she intends the meaning to say if it's Trump's policy, it's a US policy. But in the case of war and peace, as I'm going to kind of discuss here, that's not necessarily the case. And you can bring that to the idea of tariffs as well. The Supreme Court weighed in on that and said, yeah, it's not the president's sole domain for issuing tariffs unless it's some sort of emergency. So they ruled against these large tariffs. Same with war and peace. So I suspect if something drags on in Iran and it goes to the Supreme Court as a violation of war powers resolution or the Constitution, in some way, shape, or form, the judicial branch will step in. But I'm not going to talk about the judicial branch, at least in this episode, right? So I wanted to start out just by saying I'm not my expertise is in foreign policy analysis and international relations. I'm not going to delve too much into American domestic politics. I think Joe, we're gonna talk about that at a later
Yeah. That's
episode, maybe later today. But I do want to just tell you a little bit of story of my background. You're gonna have to listen to Uncle Dan's story here for a second of what really got me interested in this and how I kind of it's fit into my life over the past I don't know, 30 years. So just to begin with, and this will be brief. It's not going to be a long Uncle Dan story, but um, I graduated college 30 years ago this spring. So it's been a while, but I graduated with a degree in astronomy and physics. Um, Nothing to do with government. In fact, but I got commissioned in the Air Force out of that. I wasn't going to be an astronomer. My grade point average definitely wasn't going to let me, but I was in Air Force ROTC, joined the military right out of college, took an oath to the Constitution as an officer. The last time I looked at a Constitution was in eighth grade, like 10 years before that. So I know I really, just tangential understanding, just basically a average American's understanding of the Constitution and its history and its application. Um, so fast forward into my career a bit, really right off the bat, I experienced this tension between Congress and the executive with regards to conflict because I was deployed to all sorts of conflicts that were not declared wars, right? So the wars in the Balkans, I did peacekeeping missions. I also did peace making missions, or I guess I forget the terms for them, but stability forces for NATO in the Balkans, so Kosovo and Bosnia Herzegovina. I also went down in South America to do counter drug, or really counter FARC, which is the revolutionary group in Colombia that's no longer necessarily a player. Um, I did those missions. I also flew in Iraq for a no-fly zone in Iraq when Saddam Hussein was still there. Um, that one was authorized. They were all authorized by Congress, even though they weren't declared wars, and they all had
Yeah.
hostilities associated with them. So I learned right off the bat, and it wasn't in a bad way. It was, I think, Congress and the executive branch exercising their constitutional powers as they saw fit. And sure, there was tension in some of them. We had just gotten out of Somalia, which is a big controversy in the 90s. And so politicians and the American public were not really keen on long-term conflicts. Um, so presidents made sure that they were going to be well defined, hopefully short term, if not short term, at least to describe what the end game was. Um, and then really, I guess it still was early on in my career after 9/11, going to war in Afghanistan, which was a war of self-defense, and then Iraq, which I mentioned in my introduction was the more controversial one. But at the time, President George W. Bush had kind of readied the nation for it, even though they were making the link between, a lot of people are saying, what's Saddam Hussein have to do with Al Qaeda? So they had to make a case, and it took them there. If you read biographies on anyone in the Bush administration, you'll see that they had kind of, especially Dick Cheney, had really had Iraq in its sights from the get-go. So um, they had started making the case from the get-go of after 9/11, even though there wasn't it was a tenuous link. My point being is that the Bush administration did make this long effort to not only get Congress on board, but the American public um, and the United Nations, the international community. You had Secretary Powell going, his infamous speech now about weapons of mass destruction at the UN, saying we need a resolution to go in. The UN did not give them the resolution, but the president did get Congress rallied, the American public rallied, and there is an authorization to use military force. And that's kind of the modern day declaration of war, if you will. And we could debate what declaration of war does or means, but in a sense, it's kind of a um, archaic term. But everything I experienced in my military career was authorized by Congress, and there was a case made to the public. Um, I still, at that time, like going through all that, had never opened the Constitution to read it. I just, but when I landed in the Pentagon and working policy, this also gave me a little bit of insight because now I'm like helping make policy towards conflict. And I came in there right when we were uh, making a case, or the Obama administration was making the case to go into Libya and use force in Libya as basically like protection of civilian populations. So it was a different type of war there as well. Um, in the 90s, it was called Responsibility to Protect, or R2P. There's big debate on that. But the Obama administration kind of used that as justification. But when I was sitting at a desk in the Pentagon, in the bowels of the Pentagon, we'd get these angry letters from senators from the Armed Service Committee or representatives from the Armed Services Committee. Um, Senator Corker, I can't remember where he was from, like Oklahoma or something like that. I remember it distinctly. Um, and McCain as well. Uh, Not necessarily McCain was more like, why aren't we doing more? McCain and Hillary Clinton at the time, senators were more hawkish. But some of these uh, senators who are like, why are we going into another war? We're still in Iraq, we're still in Afghanistan. Um, so as a mid-level military officer, we were delegated the task of responding to these letters from senators and congressmen, giving them the information they wanted. Is really requests for information. Make sure that we weren't the Department of Defense and the executive branch weren't overstepping the war powers resolution. Um, so we'd have to go over to Congress, over to the Capitol building, and meet with junior staffers, which was usually a fine interaction. But sometimes you get these senior staffers in, which as a young naive person, I thought they were actually the Congress people because they're older, they're really gruff and angry. Like, oh, this guy, this guy's really upset, and thinks we're lying to him or something like that. So that was, those two experiences, both going into conflict, multiple ranges of conflict as a participant, but also as in the policymaking realm. I got to learn what this interaction, this tension between Congress and the executive about going to war. So that was my education on it, like real world education.
Yeah.
Fast forward a bit to when I left the Pentagon and went to the Air Force Academy to teach. The first thing they have you teach in there is this massive course that every student takes in the college on American government. And national security. So it's basically an American government class. And a lot of them were complaining because they had taken AP government to get into the place, and they probably knew more than I did. And those first couple of semesters back in 2014 were probably my worst teaching semesters because I didn't know much about the subject. So I had to learn about it. I went to read.
Yeah.
I heard of things like the Federalist Papers, which I'll talk about here in a second, and the Constitutional Convention and the debates that were happening there. I had to read about it and also talk to the actual experts that taught in our department on that, and that's how I got to learn it, and then just teach it for basically 6 years over the span of however long I was. I taught 6 years there, but not concurrently. Um, so that's when I really delved into the Constitution. And Joe, you probably had the same experience, right? You were in the American government class. When
Yeah.
was the last time you looked at American government and the Constitution to
I,
teach to people, right?
I I had been fortunate because although my dissertation is on comparative NIR, I was fortunate enough that I had taught American government
Ah,
like the year before. So the same
okay.
struggles that we were bringing into the
Right.
classroom, I certainly went through years before, but I completely understand what you mean. Like
Yeah. So if you think your
having to,
instructors in college are completely up on the topic, especially for junior faculty, are getting thrown into things, that's not the case. But
yeah,
we have intellectual curiosity, and we're like, well, I got to
yeah,
learn what I'm teaching, and I got to know more than these hotshots that took AP government. So
and memorized a lot.
yeah,
They memorized so many dates.
yeah. Um, So it was interesting, and that's what got me interested in the Federalist Papers. And we taught a couple of the Federalist Papers. I think a lot of universities and high schools do, like the standard uh, Federalist 51, and talking about the separation of powers. And but where I want to bring this today in this discussion is the war powers of the Constitution, which we didn't really talk about in our American politics class, even though we glanced by it. But the
Yeah,
Constitution is pretty scant on who has what powers. Uh, the president, or let's start with Article 1, which is the Congress. Congress has the power to declare war and to fund the military, to basically raise armies and navies, which means fund them, determine their size and shape and all that sort of thing. The power of the purse, it's a big power. And the declaration of war. The president is the commander in chief. And that's basically, and then there's powers to make treaty or at least negotiate. It's still the Senate has to approve treaties and tariffs and things like that. So, and alliances. So the president is the head, the lead in the foreign policy realm. But a lot of it has to have the advice and consent of at least the Senate, but the whole Congress is the one that declares war. The last time we declared war is obviously World War II. But the whole Congress also, in the modern age, approves authorization to use military force because that comes with funding and the authorization. So those are two things. Funding and authorization are two separate things. So what the Constitution says. Now, to find out how to interpret that, what always gets me when whether the press or people are talking about the Constitution and interpreting it, it does get hazy every once in a while, but it makes it seem like this was done like thousands of years ago in Sanskrit or in the hieroglyph. I can't even pronounce the word. Hieroglyph.
Hieroglyphics.
Thank you.
It's tough.
Yeah, right. So we actually have pretty good documentation of what happened at the Constitutional Convention and the Federalist Papers. This big thick book here is 88 newspaper articles written by Hamilton, by Madison, and by Jay. These three guys who are basically selling the Constitution to the public, which in turn would sell it to their state legislatures to ratify. Um, so they're basically pushing back on those that didn't want a strong central government and saying this is why we need it. And one of those reasons we needed it was for security. You couldn't have 13 basically autonomous countries loosely connected in a confederation to defend themselves. The argument was we just turned into Europe with our own arms races between states. So uh, everyone was pretty much in uniformity when they said we need uh, the executive. They didn't call it a president at the time, but the executive had to have the energy and had to have the quick thinking ability not to debate about war when it was a self-defense. Like if we were invaded by France, right after the Constitution was ratified, the president would be able to say, "I'm going to deploy forces, defend the new United States," and then go back to Congress and talk about declaring war and all
Yeah,
that. Um, but what they also agreed on is that the executive cannot have unlimited authority. The president cannot have the authority to declare war or basically make war on their own. Um, there's also an interesting some discussion or notes from the Constitutional Convention where there was just the biggest argument was about congressional power to declare war. It wasn't a conversation about the power, it was about the words. Because at first it was to wage war. Congress has the ability to wage war. And then the argument was, well, they're not the ones that are going to be, you know, putting troops out in the field. So they resolved it to declare war, while the commander in chief would then direct the forces.
yeah,
Not in command of it. That was one of the things. He can't be in command in the field. But a lot of this goes back to this idea of having a tyrant or a monarch in charge. We've just gotten through these experiences where the King of England, who was in charge of basically foreign policy for Great Britain, but also had pretty strong power to deploy and use forces abroad in the
yeah,
colonies. Um, so they did not, the framers of the Constitution were in unison. They did not want this concentrated power in the executive, that the declaration of war had to come from Congress, and that nowadays means authorization to use military force. It doesn't have to be like this formal declaration. Um, but that gives them the power to say no, right? It gives them the power to decide whether the country goes to war or not. Um, and the big link to this is that the Congress is the link to the people. At the time, the president was not
yeah,
the direct link to the people. I mean, now we vote in a popular vote. It's still decided by the Electoral College, but the president and the Senate at the time were never meant to be directly voted upon by the people. So the Congress as a whole, that means the House of Representatives, which was the direct link to the people, were going to be the ones to determine war and peace. And a lot of that had to do with
yeah,
taxation because you have to raise the funds for it. And that was a sensitive topic as well. So, so this was the debate. And it's laid out not only in the notes from Madison and others in the Constitutional Convention, but these debates in the papers about war powers. They didn't go into too much depth on the war powers because it was pretty straightforward. You don't want the executive branch to have all the power to take the country to war. It has to be deliberated
yeah,
unless it's an emergency. And that's where, like Hamilton said, yeah, the executive has to have the ability and the power to act quickly. Um, and we'll get into, I don't know if you've talked in your class about why democracies or people say democracies don't tend to fight each other. They're deliberative, but that doesn't mean they don't fight. They
Yeah,
actually do fight more than authoritarian states. But
they just fight authoritarian states.
yeah, they just fight authoritarian states. Um, so it all goes back to the power of the people and what the people want through the representatives. So you're not going to have
Yeah,
I know Joe, you did a video on direct democracy. We're never going to have a vote to go to war that's like
yeah,
a referendum, right? So we trust that our representatives are going to do the
yeah,
right thing. Um, and for the most part, in the wars that the United States has fought, there has been overwhelming support for the conflict, usually because it has some sort of more righteous purpose to it, or you can go into just war theory and all that.
yeah.
But what's interesting, let me fast forward the story, or I'm going to talk about a little bit about the evolution of the war powers of the Constitution. Even though they're pretty much in uniform in the Constitutional Convention, after the first kind of constitutional crisis that arrived was right after that in the early 1790s, I think 1793, 92, 93, where Great Britain and France went to war. And President Washington unilaterally said, we're going to be neutral. And this is what caused a stir because a lot of people wanted to back France, and there was a big group that wanted to back Great Britain. And they didn't think it was the power of the president to decide this. They thought it was the power of Congress. Um, they never went to Congress after it was a big debate about that. There's also the idea of the quasi-war in France. I think the same time period. This was not a declared war, but basically seeing the French as hostile, especially in trade situations. Um, if you know, I don't know if there's any Marines in your class or anything, but Americans kind of know the Marine hem with the shores of Tripoli. That was a war against Barbary. You know, it's kind of a derogatory term to say Barbary pirates because they're really part of the Ottoman Empire. But Jefferson went to war with them because they're interrupting our trade in the Mediterranean. Again, not a declared war, but that was authorized by Congress. Um, let's fast forward though. Um, Man, I'd love to talk about the civil, like War of 1812 and Civil War and the Mexican American War. All these have their own stories, and all of them have
Yeah.
the that tension between Congress and the executive branch. I mean, if you ever seen Lincoln, the movie Lincoln, that's not about going into the Civil War, but about basically ending it. Um, that shows the tension between Congress and the executive. Um, you could talk about Roosevelt too. Roosevelt had a lot of power, and he expanded the power of the presidency in the Great Depression and then
Yeah.
World War II. Thus, we have the two-term term limit amendment, right? Um, so fast forward to Vietnam, right? So Vietnam, again, supported by early on by a good majority of Americans um, publicly. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution is really what Congress gave the authorization. This was in the, uh, I think it's 67. I might be wrong, it might be 65. But this is where ships in the Gulf of Tonkin off of North Vietnam were supposedly attacked. Uh, President asked for authorization to retaliate and to use all force necessary to protect forces in Vietnam. And at that time, we did have like counterinsurgency trainers in South Vietnam. Um, and Congress basically gave a blank check. You have the authorization to use force. Um, and it was pretty broad. So I got 8 years later, right when this war ends, we have this kind of unveiling of the Pentagon Papers showing that the Pentagon and the president were lying to the American public and to Congress about the escalation, because it went from a few thousand, 10,000 troops in South Vietnam now to 500,000 fighting this counterinsurgency, unlimited bombing basically of North Korea, all without any congressional. There was probably congressional back and forth, but nothing. Congress was done. They signed the Gulf of Tonkin
Yeah.
resolution, blank check. So, end of war, 1973, Congress says, okay, we got to pull back this power. The 1973 War Powers Resolution, which is saying that, yeah, the president, if there's an emergency and they need to react, especially in the Cold War, and with nuclear weapons and things like that, if there's an attack on the U.S., there has to be a quick response. Can't be deliberated in Congress or in public. It has to be responded to. But if it's conventional war and the president deems it necessary to send troops somewhere or go in somewhere, That president has 48 hours to notify Congress. Can't be a secret, obviously, and that's really hard to do nowadays. You can't really keep a secret that your country's at war. And then I believe it's 30 days, or no, sorry, 60 days later, the president actually has to come, well, at that 48-hour mark, he has to lay out the plan. Saying, this is why I'm deploying troops. This is the end game. This is the scope, basically the scope and the purpose in that
Yeah.
first 2 days. And then 60 days afterward has to basically justify it. And if Congress does not approve after 60 days, does not give authorization, then they have the power to say, no, this war is over. Um,
Yeah.
like I said in the beginning, every president since then has skirted that in one way or the other, Republican and Democrat,
Yeah.
because presidents want their ability to react, and a lot of times it is in the interest or self-defense of the United States. And others maybe not, like in I mentioned Kosovo and Serbia. Um, was that a direct threat to the United States? Did President Clinton need to act and send in forces without? And so he kind of dawdled around that. Same with President Obama um, in the Libya, right? Kind of went around it. Well, we're not this thing. Well, we're not at war. It's a more protecting civilians. So you hear that
Yeah.
today. It's not a war, but that doesn't really matter. It's about having forces in there. It doesn't
Yeah.
matter if war is declared or you call it war or not. We went through this with Korea and Vietnam. We called them police actions and things like that. But it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. You're using forces, and that's what the War Powers Act was about. Um, so that leads me to right now, as I check my notes here. Um,
Just real,
so yeah,
let
go
me
ahead.
just interject. So I believe the Trump administration says they gave their 48-hour notice to Congress. Caroline Levitt came out and said that, oh, we don't believe in the War Powers Act, like all presidents. They claim that it is unconstitutional. But Caroline Levitt said we did notify Congress within 48 hours. But then we heard some stories from Congress members saying it wasn't exactly clear that the administration was. So it this tension between Congress and the executive is, we know, continuing in the Trump administration, but it seems like, at least with the 48-hour notice, that Trump did did abide by that. Um, we don't really know what they told Congress, and the story, as we know, seemingly has changed
Yeah.
or evolved, like many
Yeah.
military justifications do. They
Mhm.
evolve. So we'll see what happens next with the tentative ceasefire and the peace process.
Yeah.
What comes next? So I just wanted to interject
No, no,
and
that's a great point because I think part of the debate was that, and we live in a much more polarized world, obviously, in the
yeah,
United States. The Democrats said, well, you might have notified Republicans, but you didn't notify us. So you can't just
yeah,
notify part of a party. And then you have to have the
and
scope
may,
and what they're doing it for, right?
yeah, and maybe he didn't even tell the Gang of Eight.
Mhm.
He
Yeah.
really just told certain
Mhm.
members, not even the Gang of Eight, which typically are those that are most connected to foreign policy decisions. Yeah, yeah. Please continue.
No, no, that's exactly right. And yeah, which brings me back to my argument that this is not necessarily U.S. policy to wage war, even though the president's waging war, is because there has been not even an attempt to gain authorization, which is very unusual. And we're coming up on the 60-day mark.
Yeah,
Um, the Democrats, at least the latest version today, is they try to bring up a war powers resolution today to discuss and give authorization, at least in part. But the Republicans in the Congress blocked it again, or in the Senate blocked it. And that's happened a few times since the conflict began on February 28th, I believe. So it's been a while. Um, so it's an interesting um, use of force by a president, which I think is rightly debated. I think there's when you study the Constitution, the debates around the Constitution, and then you hear a president and their staff say, "Well, it's not a war," or so we don't have to abide by that. And I've heard that before. I heard it from different administrations throughout my time in both the government and in academia. So that's not unusual. What's unusual is, okay, and history will tell this. Was the United States an imminent threat of attack or not? And that's where the debate in the Constitution came in. The president has this power because they need to be energetic and need to be able to react to things,
Yeah.
even if the United States is not attacked, but uh, there's a sense of imminency. There was stories early on that President Trump said they had the ability with ballistic missiles to reach the United States, which the intelligence agency has said, well, that's not true. Um, there's also this idea that they could have built a nuclear arsenal within 10 days. Again, that stretches the bounds of reality. Again, this is not new. I mean, the war in Iraq was based on kind of altered perceptions of reality. This one is a little bit stretching it even further. And what makes it even more contentious is that the current administration is not really doesn't want to play by those constitutional rules, in my opinion. Like I said, every president tries to stretch them, but this presidency or this administration doesn't necessarily want to play by them. And that's problematic because, again, this is a country that's the power is given to the people via the representatives. But this is different too than other conflicts because the majority of Americans do not support military action. Even in
Yeah.
unpopular stages of wars in the past, the initial conflict was widely supported. And again, you could say, well, you could say I support the military and all that and the troops, but not the war. Um, but in polling, it's basically, yeah, we don't support this conflict. We don't trust that what you're telling us that we needed to go to war. Um,
Yeah, even when we look at George W. Bush's approval rating after 9/11, it shot up to 94%.
mhm,
And then the support for the war was in the high 80s. So we saw this, and we'll talk about it later,
mhm,
this rally around the flag effect and the support for Bush, who did not have a high approval rating prior to 9/11. And
yeah.
all of a sudden, there was this societal support for the administration, for the conflict, for the US to do something. And I think sometimes when I talk to students or younger people who weren't around after 9/11, that's hard for them to really understand
Mhm.
what the feeling in the country was after 9/11
Yeah.
the war, which when they look back and they are critical of the war now, and they wonder why we would get into Iraq or Afghanistan. But when we look at polling, like it was popular and it
Mhm.
was supported. Um, yeah,
Yeah.
in a way that's maybe hard for people that when they look at polling now for Iran, which is very bad,
Mhm.
hard to understand how much support there was for Iraq.
Yeah. And this is probably going to lead into our next discussion about domestic politics, but uh, the this type of polling matters. If you have, even if Republican senators and representatives are fully backing President Trump's agenda, they see that a majority of Americans don't like, especially for senators who their constituency is the whole state that
Yeah,
they're in. They don't really have these deep red or deep blue districts. They have kind of purple districts. They see this unpopularity. They're probably going to, especially since it is a second term president going into midterms. I assume that they're going to see some blowback from their constituents at the polls
yeah,
based on this, because as economy is a big thing, and whether we are on the
yeah.
road to recovery or not from inflation, this has definitely put a hike in the gas prices, um, which will in turn probably raise prices on other things. And that's one reason. The other reason is, which we didn't talk about, some of the rhetoric that comes from the president and his social media. is kind of alarming in the sense, like the president of the United States is our representative on the world stage, and when the threats of wiping out civilization, even though they're hyperbole from his point of view, they do hold the power of the person who's in charge, the commander
Yeah,
in chief. And that's not something that's ever come from the United States before. It's not the U.S. policy to wipe out a civilization. That's just not it. It might be the president's mindset or policy. And what he was talking about really was wiping out their infrastructure um,
yeah.
to make life hard. I don't think he was being that um, going that far as to say we're going to just wipe out the entire country, but to a point where it
Which
was,
which is also an interesting strategy because if the idea was to win hearts and minds of the Iranians
yeah,
to rise up against the existing government, then we'll see a rally around the flag effect in Iran against Americans
yeah,
because the regime will easily be able to spread the narrative that Americans are doing this to you and they are
mhm,
causing your life to get more difficult because now you don't have electricity and before you did. And so when we think of just even the idea that what Trump was hoping to achieve in Iran, an interesting message to send that we will make life hard for citizens.
yeah, yeah.
So I guess
And
if I could ask, oh no, go please.
nope, go ahead.
So I was wondering, I wanted to build off something you said. And we know in the academic literature, there's a ton of literature that says that Congress is okay giving more and more power to the executive because partly they don't want to get blamed for when things turn sideways. So if policies don't go well, they can kind of distance themselves and say, well, that's the executive, even if it's from the same party. So, do you think that's why Republicans are failing to pass a war powers resolution to kind of just allow the executive to do what they're doing? If it's kind of a political football they're handing off, or why do you think that Congress is okay in 2026, kind of taking a hands-off approach to foreign policy, if we know that the Constitution says they should have a larger role?
Well, again, it comes down to the polarization of today's politics is you're not going to buck the President Trump, who is the undeniable leader of the Republican Party and the MAGA movement. I think once, if it wasn't Trump, let's say it was, um, Rubio was the president in some
Yeah,
alternate universe, there would probably be, yeah, you need War Powers Act. You need same with what happened with Bush in Iraq. I mean, it was kind of, um, but in this case, I think it's just like we're going to show to our that we're not breaking with them, or we're not going to, because
yeah,
he is the politics of retribution. So there's going to be a bill to pay if they um, don't support. So that's why I don't think it's them separating. If you're saying that, hey, he's going to take all the blame for it, I think they are already taking. I mean, even people, the population within the Republican and MAGA movement are pushing back a lot. Like
yeah.
I saw this morning this article where people on Truth Social were pushing back on the President Trump's post about the ending civilization thing and saying this is not what we voted for. I voted for you 3 times, but I wouldn't do it again if I had the chance. So I think the Republicans in Congress right now are playing a. I think they're miscalculating um,
Okay.
with regards to how much blame Trump's going to get and how much they're going to get for being complacent, um, and not complicit, but complacent in using congressional power
Yeah.
to rein in
Yeah,
presidential
yeah, we
power.
saw Marjorie Taylor Greene, who a year ago
Yeah,
was a huge ally of the president. I think on CNN said we needed to use the 25th Amendment to remove him.
yeah.
So, yeah, we certainly see this fracturing of people who we would think would be allies in lockstep with Trump starting to break,
Hmm.
even in the online community, like what's sometimes called the manosphere. We
Mm.
see breaking away, like
Yeah.
Joe Rogan saying,
Hmm.
we didn't sign up for this conflict.
Yeah.
And maybe this questioning of why Congress isn't doing more to assert their role in a
Yeah.
way that maybe we would see the Constitution calling for.
Yeah. And I think there's a lag. Again, I don't study American politics as closely. I do with foreign policy, but there's probably a lag between support or lack of support and what Congress actually does. Like
Yeah.
maybe in a couple months, like, oh crap, we need to think about this. I know it's 6 months to the midterms, but that's going to come really quick, and
Yeah.
they're going to have a lot of damage control. Other stories I read are that, you know, citizens like in their town hall meetings are really pushing back on it, and the core MAGA group within the Republican Party is going to follow President Trump's lead on it, but
Yeah.
that's a very small, that's 30% of Republicans basically, and an even smaller amount of regular Americans, like the really
Yeah.
following him to wherever. So yeah, it's going to be interesting to see. I think it is going to be a lag. I think the senators and representatives are going to finally see that, hey, this is not popular with the people. And
Yeah.
that's where a war and a democracy and even an authoritarian state, authoritarian leaders, just like the Iranians, are very concerned about the regime security. And they're not going to get into a war that's going to cost so much that there's going to be backlash. Um, um, Putin's probably has probably fought that the last few years and been careful of
Yeah.
of what happens in Ukraine based on, you know, the sentiment of the population, even though polls show that a big majority, I think, of Russians support the war in Ukraine, but take smaller authoritarian states that might not be as established. Um, they do see public opinion as something bad that concerns them. It's not
Yeah.
completely pushed off. I mean, so it's not just democracy, but democracies especially where the power lies within the citizenry. And those representatives and senators serve at the pleasure of the constituents. And if you upset them enough, they will turn, whether you're Republican or Democrat.
Yeah, and yeah, I think you bring up a good point of this lagging indicator that we aren't quite sure what's going to happen, but we're only 6 months until the midterms. I can certainly see the domestic politics continue to evolve as when we look at polling, we know it's
Yeah,
not popular. Even the ceasefire we have now is being reported this morning. It might be breaking down
yeah,
already. So if the conflict continues, this could have large political ramifications.
yeah, yeah. So, and I think my last point on it before we
Yeah,
end this segment is just the um, where this puts the United States in global politics in the next couple years or beyond. Um, that's going to be an effect of this war, where our president has basically gone in their own direction with policy without regard for not only allies but for the population. Someone called this like our Suez moment, and I'm sure people don't know what the Suez Canal crisis was basically. I think it was both Great Britain and France, if I remember right. Both paratrooped into the Suez Canal in 1956 without consulting NATO allies. And so it really got the Soviet Union on edge. It caught the United States by surprise. Um, and it really kind of made the alliance falter a bit. It was recovered after that. But um, I think this is different because the United States is was considered the moral authority leadership in the world with regards to democracies because of the consultation with Congress, consultation with the public, and our value systems born from the Constitution. The Constitutional
yeah,
Convention was something brand new at the time. That's why it was revolutionary. Um, and we've abided by that for many years. It's had its ups and downs, but I think this again is a breaking of um, if not norms, then of constitutional um, if not law, then constitutional, at least spirit of,
Yeah.
of separation of powers or shared powers in this case.
Yeah. Absolutely. So, okay, Dan, I appreciate your analysis, your thoughts on the Iran conflict, the role between the executive and the the Congress, and I appreciate your insight and your lived experience and how that has influenced how you view the world. Okay,
And we're
thank
all
you,
living it
everyone.
now.
We're all living it now. Yes, for good or for bad.
Yeah, yeah. All right. Thanks, Joe. We'll see you next time.